Sine signum accende, emite spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus qui quaerat Fidelium Sancti Spiritus illos ratione locuisti, dormis in eodem spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatine gaudere, per Christum Dominium nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Right, continuing on. Reign of Pope St. Siricius. We're talking about St. Ambrose. We're actually talking about the life of St. Ambrose. Remember, in his writings is the first instance of the use of the term Mass in reference to the Holy Sacrifice. So the origin, we said before, the origin of that term, the etymological origin of it is debated, what exactly that means. But in any case, he was the first to use it. The church still sings several hymns of his composition. There is a general style Ambrosian chant. It's most related to Gregorian, but has a particular style to it. They have become so celebrated that they were long called by the general name Ambrosianum, because St. Ambrose had first brought their use into the Latin Church. Tradition attributes to St. Ambrose the Te Deum, the solemn anthem of thanksgiving adopted by the whole Church. We've mentioned that before, which is used by the Church very frequently. Every single feast day, it's to be recited or sung, depending on the case, at the end of Matins. Outside of that, used as a hymn of thanksgiving on occasions of great moment, very momentous occasions. The chanting of psalms by alternate choirs in public worship is also said to have been introduced by him when the faithful of Milan, imprisoned in the basilica, guarded their holy bishop against the persecution of the Empress Justina. Perhaps that may be the first instance of that in the West. It's well within the realm of possibility that was the first case of it at the end of the 4th century, at the latest, you see. So that's clearly a very ancient practice in the church, the singing of psalms by alternating choirs. But this can only refer to the Western Church, for the custom had long prevailed in the East. Now, the most glorious, undying praise of St. Ambrose is to have been Darius puts it this way, the father of St. Augustine in the life of grace. St. Augustine was born in the year 354 in the little city of Tagaste near Madura and Hippo in Numidia, present Algeria. His mother, St. Monica, had brought him up in the fear of God, but the ardent disposition of the youth led his path into the ardent disposition of the youth led him into the path of pleasures, which he joined to an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. At the age of 28, he had mastered the whole circle of human science then taught, and gained the unbounded applause of all his masters. He was then a celebrated professor of rhetoric at Carthage. His morals were those of the wealthy youths of his time, which means not good. We'll see that when an occasional ray of light, of grace, found its way into his heart, and gave him the passing desire of a life more worthy of a man or a Christian. That when he was thus moved by a wish to quit the ways of vice, he begged of God to give him a pure heart, but quickly started back, frightened at the apparent austerity of virtue, and he checked himself and added, not yet. So he continuously put it off, as his conscience was bothering him. He was being moved by grace, but was not conforming to it, and not actually received the grace of conversion yet. Still, St. Monica wished to bring forth anew this well-beloved son by opening to him the gates of heaven, as she had ushered him into this terrestrial world. St. Augustine, not yet a saint, showed no inclination to correspond to his mother's care, as if to shut out every remaining hope of conversion. He had lately taken up the heresy of the Manichees. Remember, Manichaeism, little more than reheated, repackaged Gnosticism. St. Monica told her grief to a pious bishop and begged him to labor for the salvation of the soul of her son. He said the response was, "Go, because it is impossible that the child of such tears should be lost." So continue in your efforts, continue in your prayers, because it is impossible the child of so many tears should be lost. And this prediction was, in fact, accomplished. St. Augustine went to Italy and obtained the chair of rhetoric in the city of Milan. It was at this time that the whole world was resounding with the praises of St. Ambrose as an orator. And because of that, St. Augustine, still not yet converted, wanted to hear him just because of that reputation. And the mind of the professor was powerfully affected by the gentleness, the sweetness of his gentle and impressive language, by the elegance, the majestic flow and gracefulness of his discourses, which, our author says, gave to the language of Virgil all the Attic purity of that of Plato. So his whole attention in the beginning was fixed on the delivery. Little by little, however, his mind was led insensibly along by the train of thought, and the matter outweighed the form. So that was the occasion for grace to work still further, clearly. Without, however, giving up the passions that were wearing away his life, he gave himself to the serious study of St. Paul, whose sublimity pleased his eager intellect. In the midst of his dissolute friends, whose conduct would often put him to the blush, so he was, his friends were so bad that he was not yet a saint himself by any means, was ashamed of the vices of his friends, though he still kept up an illicit connection in which he prided himself on a certain degree of fidelity. He was ever unwittingly followed by divine grace. So he was living in concubinage before his conversion. He prided himself on a certain degree of fidelity. Obviously recognized that was not, after his conversion, that was not true fidelity, even though, Bergoglio would have probably told St. Augustine he wouldn't have needed to get out of that. Because Bergoglio says that sometimes in cases of adulterous unions, or at least certainly adulterous unions, you would say that sometimes God wills that the family to keep the family together. So therefore, those who are living in adultery should continue living in adultery. So they would say, it's still, Bergoglio would say, the Novus Ordo would say, it's not ideal, but but there's a pastoral solution. That was a quote-unquote loophole that they thought they found some time ago, and that is, well, there's an ideal that the commandments are, it's an ideal, but there is also a pastoral solution, which means sometimes just don't worry about it and let people sin. That's the bottom line. The commandments are nice and all, but no, it's too hard for some people, so don't expect it of them. That was the message, and everybody understood that clearly. Again, they wouldn't say that because that would be explicitly problematic. It was problematic, in fact, what was said. It's just that it was couched in terms nice enough that so as not to upset, so as to upset as few people as possible. So doesn't fool anybody really. Some people want to be fooled, perhaps, but in itself, the way that they put things like that in the Novus Ordo, it ultimately fools nobody. Nobody with any kind of any sense of what's actually happening would be fooled by that. So St. Augustine was living in before being a saint, lived in concubinage. Grace pursued him by means of the stings of remorse, of momentary returns to self-knowledge in which he felt his weakness and asked of God with many sighs the strength necessary to overcome himself. So he was being moved by grace for some time before actually converting. In one of these moments of extraordinary feeling arising from an account which he had just heard of the life and austerities of St. Anthony, he suddenly arose and left the room, saying to his friend Alypius that the ignorant take heaven by violence, and we senseless wretches, with all our miserable knowledge, or science, not really meaning knowledge in general, rise not above flesh and blood. With these words, he buried himself in the solitude of a deserted walk in the garden, and there to calm the storm that troubled his heart. And now was the season of grace, meaning now was when he actually received the grace of conversion. So yielding to a hitherto unknown emotion, he threw himself upon his knees, exclaiming, "How long, O Lord, shall I always say tomorrow, tomorrow? Why not today? Why not now, at this very moment?" So as he uttered these words, he heard an interior voice saying to him, "Take and read." So this is the famous "Tolle lege." Those were the exact words. "Tolle lege." Take up and read. Tolle lege. That's even more. The wonderful conciseness of Latin means that it's even more concise than what we have here in the book. in English translation of this book. So, Tolle Lege, a volume of St. Paul lay at his feet. He opened it at random and read this passage, Sicut in die honesti ambulemus, non in commissationibus et ebrietatibus, non in cubilibus et impudicitiis, non in contentione et emulatione, sed iduimini Dominum Iesum Christum, et canonis coram ne feceritis in desideriis. So, that was exactly what he needed to read in that moment. All of his vices laid out in front of him as being things to avoid. This is what you get away from this. Those were exactly his problems, at least. Well, his problems continued contained amongst these anyway. All his past life with its many disorders, passions, and ambitious aims lay unfolded before his mind in all its hideous deformity. His understanding was bathed in a supernatural and irresistible light, while his heart had yielded to the charms of virtue. That's one way to put it. Yeah, Darras likes to get poetic like that sometimes. So finally, he was converted. That was the moment of his conversion, actual grace, actual receiving the grace of conversion. So the power of passion was at an end, and the empire of grace began. He quit his chair of rhetoric, gave up the hope of a wealthy alliance, so he was considering actually getting married, and all the bright promise which the world held out to his talents. He retired with his mother and his son, his illegitimate child, Adeodatus, which is actually, in itself, that's a nice name. That means given by God. Adeodatus and a few friends. He went to a solitude in the neighborhood of Milan, and he wrote some treatises during this retreat, this time of retirement following his actually receiving the grace of conversion. And then he came forth Easter Day, 387 AD, to receive baptism from St. Ambrose. So this shortly after that St. Monica died at Ostia towards the end of the same year. So the first duty to which St. Augustine devoted himself after baptism was the conversion of the Manichees, whose errors he himself had just cast off. So also that retreat that he went on was at Cassisiacum, in fact. That's the name of the name that Bishop Gerard assigned to the thesis. So not exactly sure why, if he did, Bishop Gerard, if he wrote anything about why he chose that name for it. I haven't read it myself, but it may be that it took him, even Bishop Gerard, who was a pre-Vatican II theologian, who addressed the current crisis in the church. It took him time to formulate the thesis. So it was a thing that's been it was developed a long time in development, we might say. So that's also another thing, in tangent to that remark, that is, sometimes you might wonder, what would pre-Vatican II theologians, how would they respond if they were to see exactly what we have before us today? Well, in a way, we don't need to wonder about that because we have one. Bishop Gerard was one of those pre-Vatican II theologians who addressed that situation. I mean, he was a real expert in theology. Wasn't theologian? The term theologian might get thrown around somewhat loosely, just for people who know some theology. Now, today people talk about being lay theologians, claim to be lay theologians, which was something unheard of before Vatican II. It was not unheard of that laymen would ever study theology, but it was a lay theologian was somebody who was an actual authority in matters of theology. That was something that was unheard of. So Bishop Gerard, certainly he was an expert, a true expert in theology. So in that sense, we know how pre-Vatican II theologians would respond to the situation because, in fact, one of them gave us an answer to it. So it may be, so the place of retreat, Cassisiacum, interesting to note the name, and that was the name that Bishop Gerard assigned to the thesis, perhaps because it, just as St. Augustine retired after his conversion and wrote some treatises addressing probably at least some of the errors that they wrote his works against the errors of the Manichees a little bit later, but that St. Augustine went to a retreat and produced some treatises there. So also he had to, Bishop Gerard had to take some time to consider the situation and all the principles to be employed in answering it, and only after due consideration was able to put out the answer to the correct assessment anyway to the current situation. So it was the first duty to which St. Augustine devoted himself after his baptism was the conversion of the Manichees, whose errors he had just cast off. To this end, he wrote 2 books, The Morality of the Catholic Church and The Morality of the Manichees. These he followed up with a yet more important work entitled On Free Will. In 388 AD, he left Italy and returned to Africa, where he continued his life of solitude and study near Tagaste. At this very period, Valerius, Bishop of Hippo, was beginning to sink under the weight of years and infirmities, and the holy old man, finding himself unable any longer to fulfill the duty of preaching to his people, felt the want, the need, of a learned and able priest to whom he could entrust this important ministry. So regardless of the convert's repugnance for all public employments, Valerius ordained him a priest. So that's clearly St. Augustine must have had some very, very obvious signs of a vocation, and had his qualities were evident in order that he qualified after again the life of public sin that he had led to qualify for ordination, especially so soon after, so relatively soon after. So successfully against St. Augustine, obviously, was clearly exceptionally gifted in a natural order and in a conspicuous manner as well, in addition to the grace of conversion from a life of terrible sin. And so successfully did St. Augustine discharge his sacred duties that the bishop was encouraged to ask a favor that was almost without precedent at the time, that of having St. Augustine consecrated as his coadjutor. So this is a coadjutor bishop is something that now is very common in, pre-Vatican II, very common in the discipline of the church, that there be a coadjutor, a bishop who is the designated coadjutor in the diocese, an assistant to the ordinary. And sometimes they even have the right of succession. In other words, it's clearly established that this bishop is the coadjutor bishop in this diocese, and when the ordinary dies, he will, in a sense, automatically become the ordinary. And that might be the case for any number of reasons, but one is, for example, the case of a diocesan ordinary who's getting too old to carry out the functions of ordinary anymore. But also because there's always this idea of not casting anybody off, obviously. The notion of bishops and priests who just retire and then do nothing, that's a Vatican II invention. Retirement ages and enforced retirement, which is effectively what existed in Novus Ordo, that was an invention of Vatican II. Whether Vatican II actually stated anything to that effect is another story, but you have to check the documents to see that. But certainly that came about in the wake of Vatican II. Prior to Vatican II, bishops and priests really just slowed down. They never really retired. They may have, in a sense, to an extent, retired, as they've gone effectively part-time, however you want to put it, but they would never have been cast out of their positions. There was never this idea, okay, you're done being a bishop of a diocese, now go off and live in a home someplace. There was no such idea. Effectively, a bishop was, in a sense, married to his diocese, or a priest, or a pastor of a parish was effectively married to that parish. It was as though that were the case. In other words, he's there till he's dead. And that was maintained, even in the case of the ordinary being too old to function anymore. He would have a coadjutor with the right of succession who would effectively take over as the ordinary, acting with everything he would do would be authorized by the ordinary, who was still there, in fact. But he would take over the actual running of the diocese and would succeed automatically. So St. Augustine becomes ordained after his conversion, and then the Bishop of Hippo wants him to be consecrated as his coadjutor. So the church was opposed to this usage, so there's nothing wrong with that in itself. Obviously, that is, in fact, the current discipline of the church. That is on the books, so to speak, in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. But perhaps at the time, say there may have been accidental reasons why that was shied away from. It might cause such schisms as that of Antioch, which had so long kept the public mind in a state of division. So you could see that, how that might happen if you're in a situation with problems. Somebody might be consecrated a coadjutor bishop and then cause a schism. Might say he doesn't want to wait for the ordinary to die before becoming officially the bishop of the diocese. Yep, there are people who are of such low characters and might do that. to cause a schism, not even strictly so-called a schism in the diocese, taking people with him. That's possible. As you can see, if that was a problem at the time, if a bishop requests a coadjutor, the response might be, we don't like that idea. The problems arise from that. So, but the united suffrages, those are the requests, the petitions of the bishops of the province who had met at Hippo, approved the choice, and St. Augustine was consecrated in 395. Humility, love of retirement, passion for study, regular and frugal habits, all clung to St. Augustine even amid the honors of the episcopacy. His priests lived with him, and together they led the regular, uniform life of cloistered monks. And St. Augustine put together a rule for them, and that is the rule of the canons regular. That is, canons were, you have to check, you have to do research into the whole phenomenon of canons, of cathedral canons that existed throughout Europe for a long time. They never existed in the U.S., but these canons of a cathedral church were the clergy of the cathedral church in the diocese. Every church, of course, had the clergy assigned to it, and the canons, the cathedral canons, were the clergy assigned to the cathedral church. And yes, they would, as priests in a parish typically live in the same house, so also the canons would live in common. And St. Augustine, whether or not they were called that at this time, you could see there are already the chief clergy of the diocese, whether they were in fact called canons at the time is another thing. But you can see the discipline of the church develops over time. You see the beginnings of different practices or the different policies regarding practices that are now familiar in the past. And so, yes, they had canons living in common, so they need to, we have to have some rules. Just like you have a seminary rule. The seminary is not the seminary rule is not a rule of a religious order, but it's just the rule book for what to do, what rules you have to follow while in the seminary. So also, it's natural that you have any number of clergy living in the same place. You have to have a set of rules for everybody to follow. So St. Augustine put together a rule of life for his clergy who were living in common. But you see, that was in fact this amounts to a religious rule. It's more than just the seminary rule book. This was a rule of religious life. So the seminary rule book is very short and quite thin. Just rules you have to follow in the seminary. A religious rule is something much more involved. It's much more. There's a lot more to the religious life than there is actually to the secular priesthood in a certain sense. The priesthood is in itself much higher than the state of the priesthood. Even for a secular priest, the priest who is not a member of a religious order, but secular in the sense of having to work in the world, in that sense secular, as opposed to living in a full-time in a religious house. Even the state of a secular priest is higher than that of a religious. The obligation to pursue perfection in the spiritual life is more serious than it is for a religious who is not a priest. But the religious life in certain ways is much more involved. It's much stricter in many ways. So you could get details about that. Probably Bishop Sully would be willing to give you more details about the kinds of, he did all the research for setting up the Sisters of St. Thomas Aquinas, so he knows all about all that stuff. All of the rules that religious have to follow, what goes into a religious rule and everything. It's much more involved than what secular priests have to do. Because everything about the religious life is stricter. So this is much more what we're looking at here than simply a set of rules for priests living in the same rectory to follow. But this also, again, later on led to the formation of a religious order, the Canons Regular, which followed the rule of St. Augustine. The Canons Regular are eventually canons in cathedral churches who eventually just, we're going to stop altogether being the clergy of this particular church living by religious rule and under our own roof, and instead just focus full time on being religious. And that's why it's called their Canons Regular. Regular clerics refer to priests who are religious, clerics who are members of religious orders. Regular as opposed to secular. So I'm talking about whenever you see the term regular clerics, that means priests, clerics are members of religious orders. So the canons regular, religious priests who are living according to the rule of the canons of St. Augustine. But the canons, generally speaking, the clergy of the cathedral church, it was a phenomenon that never existed in the United States because, for one reason, there was more than one reason, but for one reason, it's because the clergy of the chapter, that was the chapter of canons, they were called, they effectively shared the power of the bishop in the diocese. I mean, the idea is they were his senate, so to speak, his chief clergy, and so they had a say in things. They at least had an influence with the bishop, if nothing else. And so they had their voice counted for quite a bit. And so bishops in the U.S. also, canons were involved in many ceremonies. You read any of the rubricists, rubrical manuals, they always talk about what the canons have to do, and after the canons finish singing this hour of the office, then the ceremony begins, things like that. In the U.S., the bishops generally were not interested in doing big ceremonies, certainly not to the extent that was done in Europe. And also, they didn't want to have to share their power. They didn't want to have to deal with that. So there were never canons in this country, in the U.S. For better or worse, there just never existed here. It was an interesting phenomenon in any case. But anyway, St. Augustine was the one who set up a rule for his clergy to live according to. And that was the life of a cloistered monk, so a true religious rule. So while St. Augustine was thus ascending the scale of ecclesiastical dignities and was destined soon to take the head in the greatest religious movement of his time, another of the brightest lights of the Latin Church sought to hide its luster in the solitude of a contemplative life, to escape the employments and renown by which it was encircled, and this was St. Jerome. Since the death of Pope St. Damasus, his friend and protector, St. Jerome had felt the attacks of 1,000 secret jealousies, 1,000 rivalries, which had been concealed during the season of favor. St. Jerome, it's true, was a fiery personality, and he tended to clash with people. He definitely made enemies, and we'll see one of those, one person with whom he clashed was St. Augustine. So saints can clash amongst themselves, and both saints, in fact, both doctors of the church, but they did not get along personally. That says nothing about sanctity, not necessarily. It just means that certain personalities, even personalities of saints, just don't mesh. It's a classic example of that. So he was above these petty strifes, and he resolved to win peace by yielding to envy. He left Rome, returned to Palestine, and made his abode in Bethlehem. St. Paula and her daughter, St. Eustochium, remember they were learned women who were received instruction from St. Jerome. They followed him and placed themselves under his direction. The last days of St. Jerome's life were devoted to the study of sacred scripture, Holy Writ, sacred scripture, the guidance of souls, and the exercise of hospitality towards strangers. From the midst of these saintly labors, he passed away to receive the reward of his holy life, his long life of holy toil. So that was St. Jerome. We have a picture of him right outside, which always features pictures of St. Jerome usually feature his pet lion, which indeed he had. He pulled a thorn out of its. He came across. I don't know the full story, but they apparently at one point came across a lion with a thorn in its paw that he couldn't get out, so he removed it for this lion, and after that, the lion was very loyal to him and effectively. I don't know if pet is the right term for it, but definitely his loyal animal after that. That's true. Lions can be highly unpredictable. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but there are certain lions whose material personalities are such that they can get along with people. They're the more laid back types. They do exist. There are people who do that for a living. I don't know how you make money off of that, but people whose job it is to take care of these. I don't know if domesticated might not be the right term for it either, but these lions that have learned to get along sufficiently well with certain people, at least, they have that job. So, Gaul. So France as a nation has not yet been forged. But Gaul was not debarred from a share in the great movement which made the 4th century the richest in great names of the church's history. It's almost certainly very rich. You could make different arguments probably which era of the history of the church is the richest in saints. Daras, like the 4th century. By the side of Saint Martin of Tours, the veneration and grateful remembrance of posterity, a place has been given to Saint Paulinus, who was born at Bordeaux, of a senatorial family. So Saint Martin of Tours was not actually born in Gaul or born at Tours. He became the bishop of the city, but he was born elsewhere. Saint Paulinus was born actually at Bordeaux, which was not yet France, it's Gaul, but these most places in most cities in France and many also in England throughout Europe really have been around since the time of the Romans, and you can see that some of the names are derived from the Roman terms for those places. So London, Londinium, it's a Roman military camp. Started as a Roman military camp, which grew into a permanent city and now is one of the biggest cities in the world. Also, cities throughout France, Lutetia Parisiorum, Paris, one of those places has been around for a long time. And many of the French names of cities are, the French would say improvements, the rest of the world would say corruptions of the Roman names for different places. For example, one place that's become very famous because of I think it was a 9-month-long battle there, if I remember the dates correctly, during the First World War, Verdun, which is so famous it has its own English pronunciation, Virodunum, that was founded by Julius Caesar, which meaning essentially a strong camp. So it was another Roman military camp that grew into a famous city, which was a place that the reason why there was a battle there was because the German commander at the time understood French morale and the fact that if they managed to obliterate that area, that would destroy French morale. Not because it was of strategic significance beyond that. So that's one other story. Bordeaux, that's where Saint Paulinus was born, of a senatorial family. Again, we're definitely on the Roman Empire is on the back end of things at this point, we can say, but it's still, the empire does still exist. Again, it's becoming less and less and less Roman with time. St. Paulinus, though, is of a senatorial family, so of a high-ranking family in the empire. Is ordained at Barcelona and went to end his days at Nola by the tomb of St. Felix, whose glory he has immortalized in his Latin poems. You have a list of other saints who lived at the time. Again, notice that these are, many of them are French, and so that's probably why Daras likes this so much. I mean, not questioning their sanctity, they're recognized as saints by the church. It's just that the French like French things. They like French things to be celebrated. Something to know about them. Let's see. We've passed some of these other things. So the East was not backward in sending its laborers into the Lord's vineyard. Weak emperors Arcadius and Honorius, not to be confused with Pope Honorius of personally dubious reputation from later on, centuries later. They let the scepter fall from their nerveless grasp, so probably they were done away with at some point. That was still very common. That was one of the things that contributed to the fall of an empire is usually not due to any one factor. Sometimes it can suffer sudden major blows that bring it down. That can always happen. But usually the fall of an empire, and certainly was the case of Rome, was something that came about over a long period of time. The Roman Empire was arguably the most successful, politically, the most successful empire in history. In terms of how extensive it was, and also how long it held together, being as extensive as it was. The British Empire, of course, covered more of the globe, but fell apart very quickly, all things considered. Built up quickly, but then also fell apart quickly. Whereas, and arguably a reason for that is that they tried to impose the same set of laws really everywhere. And in other words, tried to govern that whatever portion of the globe it was they had, a huge percentage, by the laws that govern England, which by comparison is a tiny little patch of ground compared to the empire that it was ruling. And also the fact that they were preaching the Enlightenment everywhere that they went. When you preach democracy everywhere, it's unlikely that your empire will hold together for too long. So that was, they saw that. Whereas the Romans, it's something that comes up frequently in multiple, in many different contexts, from It's considering from considerations of an ordered state, actually, that the Romans had the sense to realize that they needed religious unity to hold everything together. There's no idea of religious liberty in the Roman Empire, but that they also they didn't really make every place live as Rome. They didn't impose the laws of the city of Rome itself every place they went. Yes, people had to conform to the will of the emperor. They had to pay tribute, etc. But they more or less left people be as they were, and to the point even of adding the local gods to their pantheon. So the Romans really knew how to hold things together. Clearly they knew how to build up an empire and keep it together. They were very good at that, and they intended their empire to last forever, because to this day there are Roman roads still in use. I mean, the city of Rome itself, obviously, is a place where still, how many people, millions of people still live and work there. To a great extent, yes. I mean, Rome was built up long after the ancient Romans had passed into the history books, before they effectively vanished as a nation. Because the modern Italians are not the same thing. For whatever qualities they have, the modern day Italians are not ancient Romans. Wherever they went, they certainly are not around anymore, but the city they built is still there. And that's it was built up after they vanished. Built up to a great extent in the 19th century, actually, Rome. Which, I mean, anything built in the 19th century in Europe is brand new. Ever been to Europe? You see everything is. I mean, compare mentally the United States and everything that exists in, everything that has been built in it, to everything in Europe. You can clearly see that everything in Europe is much older. In that sense, a much older place. You can't even compare places in the U.S. one place to another. You can tell this place is older than this place in the sense that it was built up much earlier than this other place. You can see that. As you travel around, you can see that. I think everything in Europe is much older. So Rome was definitely built up many centuries after, continued to be built up for many centuries after the empire had vanished. But it was the city itself still there, clearly. And many other cities they built and founded elsewhere as well, still there. Okay. So we have in the year 398 the death of Saint Gregory Nazianzen, another doctor of the Church, who wrote many books: Principle of Beings, on the Trinity, on Providence, the Angels, the Soul, the Harmony of the Two Testaments, the Incarnation of the Word, the Miracles of Christ, Virginity, the Monastic Life. At the same period, death also removed Saint Gregory of Nyssa, brother of Saint Basil. Remember, Saint Gregory Nazianzen and Saint Basil were friends, and Saint Gregory of Nyssa was the brother of Saint Basil. So all these saints, all of whom each knew one another. You get that through history, and throughout history, at various times, when you have whole groups of people, all of whom became saints. Groups of, you can tell they were personal friends who became saints. His writings were chiefly directed against the errors which that were taught in his time, so by the Arians, Sabellians, pneumatomachists. But all these great names were followed by one whose renown was given back by every echo in the Greek Church, John of Antioch, who was made Patriarch of Constantinople in 398, and surnamed Chrysostom, or the Golden Mouth. That name Chrysostom comes from Greek, two Greek words, gold and mouth. So golden mouth, there's a Greek root. You see a Y in a word. That typically means that it comes from Greek. That's the closest Latin transliteration to a particular Greek letter. One of us say this in the Kyrie eleison. That's a Latin transliteration of the Greek word for Lord, and there's a Y on that. The same letter, upsilon, gets translated. The closest thing in the Latin alphabet is the letter Y instead of the letter U. So he achieved a golden mouth. You read anything of Saint John Chrysostom, just find any quote of Saint John Chrysostom, and you see immediately why he was called that. He achieved a reputation which deservedly ranks him as the most illustrious and the best merited of antiquity. To avoid a popular sedition, it had been found necessary to remove him secretly from Antioch, thus torn from the enthusiastic attachment to that church. he was thrown like a prisoner into a carriage and carried without a halt to Constantinople. There he was consecrated by a council called for the purpose by the eunuch Eutropius, who had supplanted Rufinus as the favorite of Arcadius. So a eunuch was a very high-ranking minister in the empire. So they were, in some cases, it's interesting to see just that they were really ministers. They were meant to be servants to the emperor, to the imperial household, but they ended up being very high-ranking, very high-ranking ministers in the empire. So they sometimes you'll see that later on. For example, the campaigns of the famous, or sometimes known as the last Roman. I can't his name at the moment, but some famous campaigns late in the Belisarius, of the famous general Belisarius in Italy, that there was some interference by eunuchs, imperial eunuchs, who were sent there to oversee things. So they were clearly very powerful. Even they were, whatever they were in theory, they in fact were very powerful. So you see a council called by a eunuch of the empire. John of Antioch ascended to the episcopal throne of Constantinople, weeping over his lost repose and former independence, but he did not allow himself to be overcome by useless regrets. His first care was the reformation of his clergy and the entire extirpation of heresy. His charity reached every want, founded and endowed hospitals, houses of refuge for virgins, and directed all the efforts of his eloquence to induce the rich of the world to make consecrated temples of their abodes, by receiving in them Jesus Christ in the persons of his poor. So clearly, all of the accusations made by people who are grossly ignorant at best that the church has never done any such things as this, works of charity, is at the nicest possible conclusions that the person has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. If he's not making purposely malicious accusations against the church, but clearly the church has always been heavily involved in acts of charity such as these, and conspicuously so. There are saints who have devoted their lives to such works of charity. So, and of course, all with the approval of the church. So, move past some of these other things. We're getting very close to the end of the pontificate of Saint Siricius. So he had seen his pontificate successively illumined by all these splendors of the church. His watchful care reached every part of the world, and his authority was everywhere acknowledged and blessed. He had repeatedly condemned the excessive zeal of the Spanish Ithacians, who urged on the magistrates and tribunals two extreme measures. So it probably should be urged on, probably. That should be two extreme measures against the Priscillianists. So you see that it has happened in the history of the church that civil rulers who correctly recognized that heresy was the worst thing possible for them to have to deal with. That's just asking for trouble. Heresy being on the level of treason. Civil rulers who realize that and act in a way that is in itself justified to bring justice to heretics, to punish them if they're impenitent, to punish them for the crime of heresy, as a civil crime on the level of treason. Those who do that may be correct in doing that, but sometimes they did take it too far, and there were instances of popes who had to reel them in. So, accusations of the church being ruthless on heretics. Well, for one thing, that is that there could not be anything more repugnant to a mind infected with liberalism than the notion that someone should be punished for something he thinks. Which actually, and even that's actually a misunderstanding that there were thought crimes, that the church punished thought crimes. Anybody who has that notion is mistaken. That's what today's leftists do. They effectively proclaim themselves as being capable of reading people's minds and then punish them for what they think. That's what today's leftists do. And they imagine that the Catholic Church ever did that in the past. They're wrong. The church has never passed laws. Again, the church teaches clearly that it's sinful, even it's clear from every catechism book that even just internally doubting a single truth of the faith with all the conditions necessary for a mortal sin is in fact a mortal sin. but that the laws of the church are not configured to punish that. Yes, sin must be confessed and dealt with in the confessional, but the laws of the church governing the external forum do not punish that, because the church does not claim to be able to read people's minds. You have something to know about today's leftists, and that is they have the explicit policy of accusing everybody else of what they themselves do. I mean, that is explicitly what their policy. Whether all of them realize that or not is another thing, but it's in fact what they do. It is literally in their rule book, and that's what they do. So if you ever hear some leftist politician coming out with all these outlandish accusations, no, he's describing himself. He's describing, or his side anyway. He's describing what they do. It's very specific. Sometimes where are they? They're claiming to be mind readers clearly, but where do they come up with all this detail for this? Well, yeah, they're describing themselves. And it's amazing sometimes, just that policy of really explicit and we'll say systematic hypocrisy. It's incredible how they can do that with a straight face. It's absolutely incredible. You think they have some sense of shame, but no, they don't. In their minds, clearly everything is justified that furthers their agenda. Everything. But in any case, what we're talking about here is punishing heresy as externally manifested. The crime being, the civil crime being the public profession of heresy. As a fact, that's also the crime against canon law, against the law of the church, is the profession of heresy. That is what the church is. The laws of the church are configured to punish. The expression of heresy. We're talking here about heretics who are publicly expressing it and pertinaciously so. So people who are certainly they have fit the bill, so to speak, for heretics by all laws, by all human laws, both ecclesiastical and civil, and who need to be brought under control because of that. That's what we're talking about here. And that is clearly justified. Any process configured to punish that justly is definitely in itself just. But it is also something that has to be put into practice in a reasonable manner. And sometimes, some civil rulers might go too far in that. We notice that it's the church that reels them in. Instead of approving that or pushing it, the church reels that in. It's not the only case of that in history, not by any means. So the whole church approved his decision, the decision of St. Siricius, which was founded on the law of charity. The provincial councils sought his concurrence. Those held at Carthage in the 390s AD consult him respecting baptism conferred by the Donatists and ask if it is allowed to ordain those who have received it. The Council of Gallic bishops assembled at Turin refers to Pope St. Siricius the validity of the election of Felix, the Bishop of Treves, who had been ordained by the Athenians. He was also consulted by the bishops of Gaul, who wished to know, on the authority of the Apostolic See, what the canon laws required in regard to the continence of clerics, ordinations, and monasteries for virgins. So St. Siricius answered by a decretal, in which he repeats the instructions sent sometime before to Emerius, Bishop of Tarragona. In the most unaffected modesty and humility, the Pope lays down, with apostolic firmness and vigor, the teaching of the ancient discipline. If the dignity of his tone and bearing show him to be the ruler of the church, the vicegerent of God, the father of Christendom, the pastor of pastors, also speaks in the meekness, gentleness, and charity which eminently characterize his every word. So he died on the 25th of November, 398, after a pontificate of nearly 14 years. Tradition attributes to him the introduction into the prayers of the Mass of the Communicantes and the exclusive application to the sovereign pontiff of the title of Pope. As they have been common to all priests, expressing the spiritual paternity of the pastor over his flock. It was subsequently limited to bishops, and St. Siricius introduced the now universal tradition of confining its application to the Roman pontiff alone. So you see, once again, how even the use of terms in the church develops over time. Right. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti men subtuum presidium confugimus Sancta Dei Genitrix nostra supplicationes et despicias in necessitatibus sera periculis cunctis liberanos semper vigorios et benedicta. Amen. Noni Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.